Pode começar, Carol.
Bom dia a todos e todas, eu sou Ana Cecília Bison e quero dizer a todos que nós estamos muito felizes em realizar o primeiro Seminário Internacional Indisciplar, que conta com o apoio dos programas de pós-graduação em Linguística Aplicada do Instituto de Estudos da Linguagem, da Unicamp, especialmente por meio do Programa de Internacionalização da CAPES, Print CAPES, e dos programas de pós-graduação em Estudos Linguísticos da Universidade Federal de Minas Gerais e da Universidade Federal Paulista, a Unifesp. O grupo de pesquisa Indisciplar, Português como Língua Adicional, em uma perspectiva indisciplinar, nos termos propostos por Luiz Paulo da Moita Lopes, que é liderado por mim e pelo Leandro Diniz, da UFMG, tem tido a honra de contar com a professora doutora Clara Kittin, da Universidade de Coimbra, e com o professor doutor Alain Silva Ribeiro Carneiro, da Unifesp, como seus membros. Com eles, nós temos mantido um profícuo diálogo que muito tem contribuído para a materialização dos objetivos do nosso grupo de pesquisa e que se voltam à consolidação de uma área de português como língua adicional, engajada politicamente e responsiva às demandas sociais contemporâneas emergentes. Nessa nossa primeira edição, o seminário se dá em torno do dossiê temático Os Emaranhados do Português como Língua Adicional, cenários multilingües de imobilidade, mobilidade e agenciamento, que está sendo publicado agora em dezembro, pela revista Trabalhos em Linguística Aplicada, do Instituto de Estudos da Linguagem. E como uma das editoras da TLA, o dossiê esteve sob a minha supervisão, e tem Clara, Alain e Leandro como organizadores. Esse dossiê, fruto de um intenso trabalho de 2 anos, reúne artigos de autores, autoras brasileiros e internacionais que visibilizam diferentes cenários do trânsito do português no mundo, sempre sob a ótica da complexidade do multilinguismo e desse sensível momento sócio-histórico e geopolítico que vivemos. Eu gostaria de destacar que Emaranhados do Português é o primeiro dossiê da TLA que disponibiliza os artigos em pré-print, que é um ganho, a nosso ver, para a circulação, democratização das produções acadêmicas, e um ganho também, achamos, temos certeza, para o nosso evento, já que todos os inscritos e inscritas puderam acessar esses artigos para leitura prévia. Isso certamente dá ao evento uma configuração especial e potencializa as discussões que a gente pretende fazer aqui. Então, em nome do IEL, do Grupo de Pesquisa Indisciplar, damos as boas-vindas a todas, todos os participantes das 4 mesas que compõem os 2 dias do nosso evento, com os quais eu tenho que dizer, a gente tem aprendido muito nessa parceria que eu reitero, é um orgulho para nós, para o nosso grupo de pesquisa e para o IEL. Também damos as boas-vindas e agradecemos a todos os inscritos, inscritas que estão presencialmente e à distância nos acompanhando. Desejamos que este seja um momento de interessante diálogo e de troca de experiências. Quero muito ainda agradecer ao apoio do professor Marcelo Busato, coordenador do nosso PRINT, CAPES, do Departamento de Linguística Aplicada, para a realização desse evento. Também agradecer a parceria da Clara, do Leandro, do Alain, e dizer da alegria, Clara, que é poder receber você na Unicamp por meio do nosso programa de internacionalização. Eu tenho a certeza de que essa é apenas a primeira das muitas experiências que a gente vai ter, com certeza. Muito obrigada por compartilhar conosco, com tanta gentileza, seu conhecimento e trazer, aproximar a gente de todas essas parcerias nacionais e internacionais. né, Alan e Leandro?
Sim.
Então, eu passo agora ao Leandro a palavra, ele vai seguir dando as boas-vindas a todos.
Thank you, Ana Cecilia. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. So it's a pleasure to be here. Unfortunately, it wasn't possible for me to go to Campinas because I'm recovering from COVID, but I'm fine thanks to the vaccines, the science, and SUS, yes. But unfortunately, I wasn't able to travel to Campinas, so I'm in Belo Horizonte, where I live. So we are very happy to hold the first Indisciplar International Seminar, which has the support of the graduate program in Applied Linguistics of the Institute of Language Studies at Unicamp, especially through CAP Sprint, and the graduate program in Linguistic Studies from the Federal University of Minas Gerais and the Federal University of São Paulo, Unifesp. So the Indisciplar Research Group, Portuguese as an additional language, in an indisciplinary perspective under the terms proposed by Luiz Paulo da Moita Lopes, is a research group led by Professor Ana Cecilia Cosse-Bison and me. And this group has had the honor of having Dr. Clara Keating from the University of Coimbra and Dr. Alan Silvio Carneiro from FESP as its members. We have been maintaining with them a fruitful dialogue in search of the consolidation of our objectives towards the consolidation of an area of Portuguese as an additional language that is politically engaged and responsive to contemporary social demands. So in this first edition, the seminar promotes discussions held at a thematic dossier that will soon be published in a few weeks, yes, in December. The publication will be at the Trabalhos em Linguística Aplicada journal, which is a journal of the Institute of Language Studies at Unicamp. And this dossier is entitled The Entanglements of Portuguese as an Additional Language, Multilingual Scenarios of Mobility, I-Mobility, and Agency. The dossier, organized by Clara Keating, Alan Carneiro, and me, with the great help of Ana Cecilia, is the result of a 2-year partnership and brings together articles by Brazilians and also by international authors. And we would like to express our gratitude to all of them for their great contributions. So these articles, those of you who have been able to read the prints already, or those who will do it later, as you will see, are texts that make visible different scenarios of the Portuguese in the world, always from the perspective of the complexity of multilingualism and the social, historical, and geopolitical moment we live in. So Ana Cecilia, on behalf of the Yale, along with Clara, Alain, and me from the research group Indisciplar, we would like to welcome all our participants from the 4 tables that participate in this 2-day event. And as Ana Cecilia pointed out, we've learned a lot in this process of the organization of the dossier with all the texts you have written. So this is a reason of great pride for us. And we would also like to welcome those of you who are participating in the event, either in person at Unicamp or through YouTube. We hope that this event is full of moments of interesting dialogue and enriching exchange of experiences. Ana Cecilia also thanks Marcelo Busato, yes, the coordinator of the graduate program in Applied Linguistics. And finally, personally, I would like to thank Ana Cecilia, Clara, and Alain, especially, with whom I've been able to learn a lot through the organization of the dossier. So thank you all for sharing your knowledge. And thank you very much also to the employees from Yale and to Ana Cecilia's students who worked hard to make this event possible. So we wish you all a great event. And to continue, I'd like to invite Professor Clara Keating and Alan Carneiro to present some reflections stemming from our dossier. Thank you very much.
Okay, so sorry about all these technological problems. I mean, this is me presenting in Zoom. It's always complicated, but thank you, Ana Cecilia and Leandro, for such a wonderful and generous invitation. Let me just start talking on my behalf here, because this is just a very special moment for me, because my colleagues have challenged me to live out of my little bubble in European Portugal and explore the entanglements of Portuguese as an additional language with all the work that has been developed both in Portugal, Brazil, and other areas in the world. And this has been an extremely enrichful and very empowering experience. So I really need to thank Ana Cecilia, Alain, and Leandro for challenging me to start doing things with them. So this is my first. My first words in this event. Okay, so let me just start what we're going to do here in this presentation. The times we live in, such as the recent COVID-19 pandemic, climate change, political and economic radicalization movements, and their impact on institutions, the constant deterioration, erosion of human rights, crisis movements and migrations, all of them are complex knots that challenge and pose the radical possibility of dismantling definitions of human and non-human existence. They call us to reposition ourselves in a logic of hope, care, and affection as we face on a daily basis the subtle yet violent pressures of natural, technical, and political order. So I've got aqui, right? Yeah. The volume presented here aims at repositioning research perspectives and identities, as well as construct and develop critical reflexivity, also in applied linguistics, more specifically in the field of study of Portuguese as an additional language. It brings together research and applied work, which, given its empirical focus, many times exploratory and from distinct angles of approach, has the common strength of exploring languages of description that make an attempt to think alternative modes of production of knowledge in multilingual contexts traversed by mobilities and migrations. Our point of departure is the lived experience of speakers on the move, i.e., traversed by a condition of mobility and or migrations, past or inherited, contemporary or lived, or just plainly desired. The focus on speakers traversed by migration creates a deep challenge of ethical, sociocultural, political, epistemic, and methodological nature, which goes well beyond this text, even though it is our aim to contribute to this topic. Punctuated, inspired by the works here presented, sometimes extrapolating from their spaces of action, we identify three of the various angles of this challenge. First, the challenge of movement, migration, mobility, and multiplication of borders. Second, the heteroglossic, multilingual, and multisemiotic, as well as material entanglement of speakers' lived experiences with Portuguese as an additional language. Third, the cohabitation of ontologies and modes of production of knowledge. So the outline of this, we need to interrupt. Yeah?
Probleminha, não está passando as telas.
Okay, there is a problem with
Vídeo também.
Tem iniciar vídeo também, não é?
Aí, tá certinho agora.
Okay, sorry about this this interruption. So let us move on and organize and give you the outline of our presentation, right? So we will start with an understanding of migrations, mobilities, and the multiplication of borders, and focus on speakers on the move. Then we will talk about multilingual, multisemiotic, material entanglements and scenarios, and how they configure pluriverses. And then Alain will follow and talk about materialities and the borders and the political economies involved, as well as the dynamics of borders. I mean, the action, the interaction, the ways in which it relates to pluriverses. And finally, Leandro will resume talking about Portuguese as an additional language in the light of these materialities of migrations, movements, and the borders. And then we will conclude the presentation with the structure of the dossier. Okay. So let us just talk a bit about migrations, mobilities, and movements, nothing that we do not know already of anthropological and sociological inspiration, but also from cultural geography, a theoretical orientation that is founded on principles of mobility, of movement of people and good, as well as the forced migrations in our actual times in various parts of the globe, forces us to overcome dominant rationalities, which are founded on stability, and the mobility, the angle of movement of people, goods, and resources allows us to look at actions at multiple scales, and assuming the complexity of elements that cohabit in very hybrid places of survival, which are forged in the encounter, the encontrão, the big encounter of discovery of difference. So to follow the patterns, the trajectories, the circulations, the motions, also allows us to recognize those patterns of connection, those knots of affinities and solidarity between speakers, individual or social, given the survival necessities and citizenship problems, as well as those dense patterns of disconnection, of repeated invisibility, of repeated absence of listening. So it is not only, we cannot really think about movement only as from an angle which is merely celebratory, but also what counts as space and territory with all the frictions and the tensions, local, regional, national, transnational, global, among many other scales, be them material or symbolic. And Tsing's idea of Anna Tsing's idea that cultures are co-produced in friction is particularly useful to think lived experience of speakers in migrant contexts. In the dynamics between movement and the friction of the encounter with difference, those malfunctions, unequal, unstable, and creative qualities of interconnection emerge unexpectedly and in improvisation. So difficulties, constraints, disquiets, they emerge and create frictions in apparently well-oiled mechanisms of progress, development of the system. In the metaphor of the author, it is as if a fly in an elephant's trunk. In fact, she says, motion does not proceed this way. How we run depends on what shoes we have to run in. Insufficient funds, late buses, security searches, and informal lines of segregation hold up our travel. Railroad tracks expedite it, but guide its routes. Some of the time we don't want to go at all, and we leave town only when they've bombed our homes. It is these kinds of friction that inflect motion, offering it different meanings. Coercion and frustration join freedom as motion is socially informed. As Sandro Mezzadra and Brett Nielsen put it, it is not only about studying the border as an object of study, but rather assume the border as an epistemic principle that operates at all dimensions of the symbolic and the material, technological, social, historical, and political activity that forges and constitutes borders, govern borders, proliferate them. Using border as a method allows us to grasp the dynamics of power ideologies, citizenship, and agency that act in the proliferation of economic work and differential barriers, obstacles of political, legal subjectivities that govern the contemporary world in deep transformation and turbulence. From this angle, it then becomes very difficult to think lived experience of migrant speakers without looking at the trajectories of human and non-human elements, material and immaterial, that configure the political economy of the places where we find these speakers as participants, collaborators, or constructors of knowledge in our studies. So there is the narrative experiences in this volume, they are, because of the fact that they're highly complex and entangled, they are multilingual, multi-semiotic and material, they all bring together the search for languages of description, as well as we have managed to follow how they become material by iterative stabilization, destabilization processes, ontologically inseparable from the particular phenomena. So looking at each one of these work has allowed us to explore and identify the agential cuts, because the unique performativity of each one of the works allows us to look at how they become resources as if they were Portuguese. So becoming Portuguese becomes, it is as an additional language, emerges throughout the work of doing knowledge named Portuguese. And this kind of understanding allows us to challenge logocentric understandings, hence colonial and racial linguistic ideologies, side by side with other possible ontologies, cosmologies, and visions. So we explore an ecology of knowledges and pluriverses based upon the idea of the epistemological diversity of the world, the recognition of the existence of a plurality of knowledges beyond scientific knowledge. As Santos would say, it implies renouncing any general epistemology. Throughout the world, not only are there very diverse forms of knowledge of matter, society, life, and spirit, but also many and very diverse concepts of what counts as knowledge and the criteria that may be used to validate it. And this is more or less what we have been following throughout the special issue. And now Alain goes back to political economies.
So thank you, Clara. So we took this reflections that Clara made here as our departure point to think how the complexity of this multilingual scenarios of migration are structured and organized. So when we started thinking about this introduction, a very important point that has been important in the field of sociolinguistics and applied linguistics for a while was the issue of political economy and the political economy of languages. So we took this idea of the border as an important issue because it helps us to interrogate the constructs underpinning our analytical frameworks constructed in modernity, built on its classic binarisms as subject and object, mind and body, culture and nature, all these binarisms that structure our ways, our contemporary ways of thinking, become very cloudy when we are analyzing contexts of mobility and migration. So, and then also, despite of these, we have to look at the histories of colonialism, racialization, subalternization, and how they play a role in the ways that our actual realities are arranged. So you are concerned with the arrangements of reality that are influenced by these trajectories of colonialism, racialization, and subalternization. And at the same time, how in mobility contexts, these are all very dynamic and in constant change. So when Clara says about becoming Portuguese, understanding how Portuguese as an additional language is in a constant becoming, we are trying to grasp this complexity of all the resources that are at play in specific scenarios of interaction. So, and how this complexity are constitutive of specific pluriversal worlds. And then when we look at all the papers of this special issue, we could see in the spaces in between possibilities of other arrangements and different axiological, ontological, and epistemological arrangements. So then, because of this discussion, we thought that the traditional way of thinking about political economy and political economies of language that has a special focus on the idea of hierarchy would be better understood if we think about heterarchies. The idea of heterarchical thinking is an attempt to conceptualize social structures with a new language that breaks with the liberal paradigm of 19th century social science. The old language of social structures is a language of closed systems, that is, of a single overarching logic determining a single hierarchy. The notion of logics here is redefined to refer to the heterogeneous entanglement of multiple agents' strategies. The idea is that there is neither autonomous logics nor a single logic, but multiple heterogeneous, entangled, and complex processes within a single historical materiality. So because of this, we got at the conclusion that to understand the multiple ways in which flows of migration are established, migration trajectories are constituted, and how different resources are accessed, valued, and devalued, challenges approaches that takes as the departure point the nation state. So it's important to consider the complexity of how the political economies of mobility are structured and lived, considering different socioeconomic, political, and historical conditions, and how the political economy of language, the ways in which language and multisemiotic resources are represented and experienced, changes across different times and spaces. So, because of that, we thought that the kind of tools that we have in the traditional sociolinguistics, as the ones that are based on a perspective that is connected with variational perspectives on difference, or that as we have in Brazil and Portugal, or even like the discussions that have been hegemonic in the field of Portuguese language studies around the pluricentric languages, are not enough for us to understand the refracted and diffracted experiences of living and mobilizing different communicative and social resources in the making of a life. So what we could see in all the papers that we have received for this special issue was that that language was an important dimension of the life of people, but in this migration context, there are so many dimensions that are in connection with the languaging strategies that makes it more complex to be understood. So the authors are still exploring all this complexity. So we had a big challenge when we were trying to understand how to interpret the dynamics of mobility and migrations. That actually, when we look closely at it, probably I would say that is the biggest challenge that we have in social sciences and human sciences to understand and conceptualize new ways this mobility paradigm. So we had read a lot of geographers when we are preparing our introduction, and it was very important to see that they are also struggling with thinking about these issues. So when we look closely to this, for example, to the flows of mobility that have appeared in the different papers, like the ones between Brazil and United Kingdom, Timor-Leste, Portugal, United Kingdom, African countries, and Portugal, Brazil, Paraguay, Argentina, and how the subjects are circulating and crossing these different places, we could see that there is a flow of resources that changes are constantly changing their values. And also sometimes some resources that lose their values or are not valued in some contexts, like, for example, the ones that in the text of Mike Yolana, we are going to see, the one of Afro-Brazilian Portuguese, can become a very important resource, for example, in the practices of capoeira in another country. So, and then we could see also that in these processes of mobility, there are changes in the value of educational resources, changes in the professional recognition and insertion in the job market across contexts. And also there is an important role of remittances in changing the situation of this different contexts. So all of these discussions were already mapped by the studies of mobility and migration, and they appeared in the articles of the special issue. But what we felt is that we needed to try to conceptualize this in a different way. And this is why we are thinking about this idea of border dynamics and how action, interaction, and pluriverses are constituted in these social spaces. So the immanent nature of heterogeneity in each context point out to the singular performativity of the resources named as Portuguese, but that actually are forged constantly in between humans and non-humans, multiple linguistic and non-linguistic resources, bodies and objects, institutional and physical spaces. So because of this, we took as an important basis for our reflections the discussions of Skolin that have been reflecting for a while about how languaging is materially placed in the world. So as we all know in the field of sociolinguistics and applied linguistics, Skolin and Skolin studies had a huge impact in our area, but it was difficult to think about the way they were thinking because they expanded in a so broad way our issues for reflections, and are still incorporating these debates in our area. When we are thinking about, for example, about the issue of semiotic repertoires, and we are just starting to discuss in a deeper way, semiotic process. So we're still in this moment of thinking about these issues. But a problem that we identify in the area is that our theorizations that were based in a representational view of language offers a problem to think about semiotic repertoire. So what we are trying also to do is advance in a new way of theorizing how our reality is constituted. So this is why we went to the debates about new materialism. And as you know, there are a lot of new materialisms going on, different kinds of theorizations. So for our discussion here, it was very important, the work of Karen Barrett and also other feminists as Donna Haraway. But for example, Catherine Malabou has been doing a very interesting discussion about epigenetics that departs from a material conception of who we are as humans, and from these expands the debates about materialistic views. So, but then the idea of action from Scollon and Scollon was very important for us, because nexus analysis is the mapping of semiotic cycles of people, discourses, places, and mediational means involved in the social actions we are studying. We will use the term nexus of practice to focus on the point at which historical trajectories of people, places, discourses, ideas, and objects come together to enable some action within in itself alters those historical trajectories in some ways, as those trajectories emanate from the moment of social action. So we thought that this idea of focus on action is very important for us to understand how this context of mobility and migration are structured. And besides of this, from Karen Barrett, we brought the idea of interaction. So Karen Barrett makes a very important point in questioning the idea of interaction, because the idea of interaction presupposes that some entities exist before the action actually happens. And then she comes with the idea of interaction to think that actually what we understand as entities in an interaction are built in the interaction in itself. So what she says is the world is a dynamic process of interactivity and materialization in the enactment of determinate causal structures with determinate boundaries, properties, meanings, and parts and patterns of marks on bodies. This ongoing flow of agency through each part of the world makes itself differentially intelligible to another part of the world, and through which causal structures are stabilized and destabilized, does not take place in space and time, but happens in the making of space-time itself. So the idea here is that in this process of interactivity, is that the world is materialized as such. And this is what allows us to interpret the world as we interpret it. So this is an important point, because it changes the idea from the structuralist and post-structuralist views that we have on language and semiotics, that is mainly based on representational views of how communication is organized. So with this idea, we are going to try to understand, and it's very interesting that Karen Barrett comes from the field of physics, to understand how actually in the process of interacting as we usually try to understand reality, we have actually interactionality. So in the sense that we are all the time building and differentiating material and non-material, and building boundaries and defining properties and interpreting meanings from the actual realities that we are living in. So, and this is obviously very connected with the post-humanistic approach in relation to language and semiotics, but it's important also to highlight that we have different post-humanisms in debate, actually. So this is a type of post-human way of interpreting reality, because here for Karim Barad, the idea of agential realism is very important. So the analytical challenge for Barad is to understand in a situated way this materialization process through multiple agentialities that play both in the constitution of determined times and spaces and in the differentiation of what counts as human and non-human, subject and object, culture and nature, mind and body, discourse and matter. Because we are interested in multilingual and multisemiotic dynamics, it's up to us to understand the agentialities that play in the materialization of what counts as linguistic, semiotic, or communicative resource, an object, and how they are transformed into something immaterial or symbolic. It's these agentialities and the agential cuts produced by them that make a given word intelligible as we know. It's in this way that scientific doing is for Barad an ethical, onto-epistemological gesture, as it's through these interactions that word arises. So we are looking at resources and repertoires as immanent. So a social material, agential, and abyssal reflection allows us to open space for other ways of characterizing teaching and learning, repositioning debates around the formal, non-formal, and informal, opening ourselves to the complex dynamics of acquisition process and socialization and multiple registers and beyond, and mainly to rethink resources and repertoires as immanent dynamics of action and agency. So, considering the kind of synthesis that we're trying to get at with these discussions, so we have here at one side materialities and at the other side sound and epistemology. So from the side of materialities, we are thinking about disrupting and decentering anthropocentric approaches to human language and thinking about it as distributed across human and non-human actors, polycentric and multi-sided. We are thinking about resemiotization away from the human meaning-making gaze and identifying the micro-political tensions at play in actions, activities, and taking a performative, pragmatic, aiming at horizontal understandings of difference. So this takes us to these issues of the sound and epistemologies, so the ecology of knowledges and pluriversity, multi-centered and multi-sided pluriversities, based on an ethics of care, radically local, pragmatically oriented to the lived consequences of vulnerability, a sociolinguistics that matters, and thinking abyssal lines of thinking, doing, saying, permeated by coloniality, patriarchy, and capitalism. So we are focusing our eyes on this complexity of the immanence plan and its possible becomings. So now we'd like to give the word to Leandro so he can talk a little bit more about the articles of the special issue.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alain. So I'm going to talk a little bit, very briefly, about Portuguese as an additional language in the light of the materialities of migrations, movements, and the borders. So, in other words, I'd like to discuss some possible impacts that working with these materialities may have in the area of Portuguese as an additional language. So the first impact I would say is that, and maybe this is the main point, I would say that the main contributions that the materialities of migrations, movements, and the borders bring to the area of Portuguese as an additional language is to politicize this area more and more. So, as Ana Cecilia and I have argued in other texts, and as Clara, Alain, and I have discussed a lot in several occasions when organizing the dossier, we believe that we need to build another agenda for this area, moving away from an agenda that, guided by the North, has been limited to a great extent to a discussion about approaches, methods, and techniques, and frequently erasing the political, the social, and the ideological. So against this paradigm, and that's why we are here at this event as well, we would like the Portuguese as an additional language area to be increasingly politically engaged, responsive to the contemporary social demands, ethically committed to the construction of a counter-hegemonic globalization. An area that calls for dialogue with voices from the South, and an area that breaks with the disciplinary logic as proposed by the critical, indisciplinary, or transgressive applied linguistics. So I do believe that in recent years we have made significant progress in this direction, and the contributions of research concerning migrations, movements, and the borders have a key role in this shift. So I hope this body of research continue to grow stronger and stronger. So the next point, Alain, if you could please change the slide. Thank you. So another important impact I see is that when you work with migrations, movements, and the borders, it's very hard to be limited by a disciplinary perspective. On the contrary, we need to establish a dialogue with different fields, and almost anyone who does research or develops outreach actions concerning migration realizes that easily. So in addition, such studies and actions favor the dialogue of researchers with actors from the public power and from the civil society, making evident the importance of having professionals in the area of Portuguese as an additional language directly involved in public policies. Yes, we do need to be more and more present in such places, yes, participating actively in public policies. So I believe that working with the materialities of migrations, movements, and the borders helps us to realize that the Portuguese as an additional language area cannot be conceived without dialogue with other areas of knowledge and without the dialogue with different social actors. So the next slide, please. Thank you. And despite the strengthening of the discourses about the so-called pluricentrism of Portuguese, it is very common to observe highly nationalist discourses about Portuguese. So, for instance, to give an example, the nationalism is at the base of proficiency requirements in Portuguese for naturalization purposes, which may be observed in Portugal and in Brazil. Yes. So immigrants who wish to have the nationality, the Portuguese nationality or the Brazilian nationality, do need to prove that they are proficient in Portuguese. Yes. And this nationalism may also be observed when Brazil obliges candidates for the undergraduate student agreement program, yes, PEC-G, to prove proficiency in Portuguese, even if they come from a country where Portuguese is an official language, and that comprehends the African countries where Portuguese is an official language, and also East Timor. So even if students who wish to participate in this program, PEC-G, come from one of these countries, and almost always they have studied in a system which functions only in Portuguese, or a scholar system where Portuguese has a central role, yes, but despite that, Brazil requires these candidates to prove proficiency in Portuguese, yes, through CELPE-BRAS. So along with other colleagues, we've been struggling to change that, but with no success so far. I believe that this is also an important piece of evidence of the nationalism that we can frequently observe. Frequently, we can also see formulations like Portuguese is an economic asset in the current century. Portuguese is a language that has won the globalization. Portuguese is spoken on 4 continents by more than 200 million people. It's the 5th most spoken language in the world. And it's interesting to notice how these numbers and positions can vary quite a lot, yes, depending on the perspective from which we speak. But my point here is that such formulations capitalize certain varieties of Portuguese and erases the communities and bodies which speak Portuguese among many other resources. So, in my view, working with materialities of migrations, movements, and the borders helps us to denationalize and to decapitalize our view on the resources we name as Portuguese. It helps us to make visible different people who do not have Portuguese as their mother tongue and who historically have received very little attention in the Portuguese as an additional language area. So migrants and their descendants, yes, who have been present in Brazil, for instance, for many decades. It's not a recent movement, even though the movements now have other traces, yes, but Brazil is constitutively a country where migration plays a key role in the structure of the society, yes. But only recently the area has started being more concerned about this public. People who live in the borders, yes, deaf people who speak the Brazilian Sign Language or other sign languages in Brazil, and indigenous peoples as well. So working with the migration, movement, borders helps us to comprehend better that Portuguese itself is a construction that is inseparable from the constitution of the modern state-nation, and it helps us to conceive a more diverse language policy in which the teaching of Portuguese as an additional language does not participate of a process of cultural assimilation, but on the contrary is structured together with actions to the strengthening of minoritized languages. The next slide, please. I'd like to present you briefly the structure of our special issue, and you, as Ana Cília mentioned in the opening of this event, you can already read all the articles in preprint, and you have the opportunity to listen to the authors who have kindly accepted our invitation to participate in this event as well. So in addition to this first presentation by Clara, Alain, and me, we have, and which opens the dossier, yes, entitled The Entanglements of Portuguese as an Additional Language, Multilingual Scenarios of Mobility, and Agency. So we also have the article Portuguese ao pé do berimbau, on Capoeira as an Additional Language by Mike Benham and Juliana Hanusova. We also have an article by Estevão Cabral and Marilyn Martin Jones entitled Mobilizing Linguistic and Semiotic Resources, Constructing Identities in Local Life Roads, Migrant Workers from Timor-Leste and Their Football Clubs. A fourth article called Eu Sei Escrever Bonito com Caneta, Literacy with Adult Immigrants in an Informal Project, an article written by Ana Signorello and Ana Raquel Matias. Another article by Sabine Gorovitz and Letícia de Souza Sá, Linguistic Mediation as a Guarantee of Rights in Brazil Towards Institutional Translation and Interpretation Policies in the Federal Public Defender's Office. Another one by Bruna Frasato and Ana Cília Costa Bison, Tensions Among Portuguese in Meta-Commentaries from East Asian International Students in Brazil. Another article by Simone Carvalho and Margaret Schlatter, Indigenous Repertoires, Voice and Agency in Master's Thesis Writing. And finally, an article by Graça Cordeiro and Giuseppe Formato, Portuguese Language Tensions and Contradictions in Diasporic Contexts, Ethnographic and Confessional Narratives in Greater Boston. So, thank you very much. We can share this link in case you still don't have it. It's where the articles the preprints, yes, may be read. So, thank you, muito obrigado a todos, a todas. So we invite now for our next presentation, yes, which is entitled Portuguese ao pé do berimbau on Capoeira as an Additional Language by Mike from University of Leeds and Yolena from University of Southampton. And we'll have Catherine Kell mediating and also Clara Keating. Yes, so thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Leandro. We are a bit delayed. I'm not really sure what time it is, but I think we have plenty of time because this is, we only have one presentation in the morning, so there is some time here to bring it all in and kind of create some debate. So if anyone wants to bring up a chat, if anyone wants to bring some questions throughout the chat, please do. We're allowing about 10 minutes or 5 to 10 minutes to have some debate if you want to. We have actually received already a question by YouTube. Marcelo asks, mobility is not the same for migrants and students. Don't you think that this should be taken into account for the various plurilingual political actions? And I don't know, Alain, would you like to respond, or Leandro, would you like to respond? I've got some ideas on this, but I'd like you to say something about it. Yeah.
Yeah, I do think that this is an important question, but we have, mainly coming from the studies in social sciences, a concern that is related to classifying different types of mobility. So classifying or student mobility, crisis mobility, and despite of the fact that this is very important as a departure point for us to understand how mobility happens and how different multilingual and multisemiotic resources are mobilized in specific scenarios of migration, what we see actually is that mobility in different spaces and places are more mixed than we imagine that they are. So when we see, for example, the organization of migration communities, we see a more complex picture because, for example, even if we distinguish student mobility from crisis mobility, sometimes, for example, the idea of the national becomes a resource for people to become closer and build communities. So sometimes we can talk even about this, considering our own experiences of mobility, because sometimes when we go to other countries, sometimes we look forward to meet up with people from the place where we are. even if we are in the space of the university. So sometimes to look at these ways of circulating and migration context would be important. What doesn't change the fact that, for example, as for example, one of the articles of Ana Cecília Cossi-Bison and Bruna Frasato shows the importance of the university to be aware of the specificity of different groups of students and student mobility at the university and the need of specific policies for them. So it doesn't change this fact, but sometimes we would need a more dynamic way of understanding these processes.
Thank you. Leandro, would you like to say something or?
Yes, just a brief comment. I agree with that. Yes, we have potentially very different movements when we think about certain kinds of mobilities in academic level and when we think about other kind of movements. But I agree with Alain that it's always better not to pre-analyze these movements. Yes, so frequently students who are just seen as, for instance, just exchange students, but they experience mobilities very differently, yes, according to a series of factors that are at play. Yes, if the person comes from a country or for another, if he's white or not, if he's rich or poor, if it's a man or a woman, and so on and so forth. Yes, so there's a very interesting documentary which I saw a few years ago, but which focalized two students living in Florianopolis, and they both were studying at the same university, and they when you see what one of these students says and what the other student says about the experience of living in Florianopolis and of doing undergraduate studies in Brazil, it's as if they lived in totally different worlds. Yes, and indeed they were living and they were experiencing in radically different worlds. Yes, so I think this kind of question should be a concern for our actions, for our policies, and for our research. That's it.
Okay, thank you. There's also, Mike Wenham is also bringing an interesting contribution here, talking about the UK. In the UK, the state includes students in migration statistics. Mike, would you like to talk about this?
Yes, this is something quite, I don't know if it's significant just for the UK, but the UK government includes international students in migration statistics. And these have blown up this year. So there's a kind of moral panic around migration. So one of the strategies the government might use to massage the immigration figures is by cutting or limiting access to students or saying you can't bring your families. So this student and the mobility issues, sometimes they cut across. The mobility issues in the UK are definitely crossing with migration at the moment in not a great way. That's just a comment, really.
Yeah, thank you, Mike. Yeah. I was going to say a bit more or less the same. It is, when we think about when we ask these questions, that this should be taken into account for the various plurilingual political actions. We tend to have. I always have a hermeneutics of suspicion regarding to where does my question come from? From me as an actor, an institutional actor, from me as a speaker or a migrant, as a migrant speaker, because the issue here is that the very concept and the very aspect of being named as migrant or being named as mobile student or a mobile speaker is actually placed and situated in a nexus of many cross discourses, cross discourses, which, as we have seen, and I think that Mike has brought a very interesting aspect there, are being appropriated by governmental agencies to create their own statistics and their own policies. So if we think about the radically local aspects of institutional action, or informal, non-formal, and formal entangled, it might bring us more aspects and more kaleidoscopic aspects to how we are being named, how speakers are being named, or how the spaces are being named for speakers. What are the conditions for speaking out, so to say? So this is just what I'd like to add here, which I think it's also a concern, I think, in the papers. So it is just a comment, of course. Not sure if anyone would like to say something else. No? Okay, so I'm thinking that maybe we can, take about 5 minutes for a break, or should we continue? Okay, they say that we should continue. Okay, so maybe we can. Thank you very much for listening out, and we might continue now and move on to the first papers. And here we are thinking about an hour session. Apologies if we're 23 minutes late. That's not too much, I mean, yeah. Well, but we will start now with the first session and with the first paper. And let me just introduce the authors of the paper. Jolana, you're there? Yes, you are.
Yes, I am. Hello.
Please be very welcome. Let me just write down a bio note on the two presenters, and then the discussant, Kathy Kell, she's also there. Okay, so Jolana Nusofa was a researcher on the TLANG project, which informs a contribution to this special issue. With a master's in Portuguese philology, she is fluent in Portuguese and also an experienced capoeirista who runs events in Leeds. As well as working with Mike on the present paper, she contributed to another paper in the theme issue of Euler Review, Meaning Making from the Periphery, which was edited by Luís Paulo da Moita Lopes and Mike. Okay, then we have Mike Bainham. He's an emeritus professor of TESOL in the School of Education. His professional background is in adult ESOL and literacy. Before his position in Leeds, he spent 10 years in Sydney at the University of Technology, where he was director of the Centre for Language and Literacy. And before that, he worked in London in adult and higher education. Even though his academic background is in social linguistics, he's always been involved in and committed to applied linguistics, and worked as chair of the BAL and co-convener in important Euler research networks on literacy and language and migration. His research interests are various. He's interested in lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer. Also consultant of the British Council Nexus project, exploring LGBT lives in adult ESOL. A fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences in Australia. He has worked extensively in both places, Australia and the UK. And he has developed work on the articulation of translanguaging and translation studies. His recent work has manifested in his publication with T.K. Lee on translation and translanguaging. And Mike's community-based social linguistic work with adults is in the crossroad of these issues: translation, LGBT studies, literacy, and narratives in migration spaces, which is a challenging angle and very inspiring for us. And then we have, and then Catherine Kell, she will be the discussant of this paper. And she's an associate professor of language and literacy education in the School of Education at the University of Cape Town, and recently completed a term as director of the school. She has been involved in literacy education since the early 1980s, initially as an activist in NGOs, which drew on Freirean approaches to teaching literacy and language to adults in the trade union movement and in community organizations. Since then, her research and development work has been based in schools and classrooms, higher education institutions, informal settlements, development projects, social movements, and workplaces in South Africa, New Zealand, and Tanzania. She focuses on literacy as everyday social practice through a linguistic anthropological lens, using ethnographic methods. Her main areas of research focus on theories of literacy and on literacy in curriculum and pedagogy in education, but her wider interests involve understanding the world as textually mediated and the variable ways in which people take hold of different means and modes of communication within wider communicative ecologies and economies. Recent projects examine digital technologies in literacy teaching and grade 1 literacy learning. So here we have our three contributors, and the floor is yours. There's an hour, so you might take 30 minutes, 20 to 30 minutes, whatever you feel it's best. And then Kathy will have more or less the same time if she wants. Okay, so thank you very much for all of you being here. And Kathy, thank you so much for discussing this. Okay, so the floor is yours.
Hello, everybody. Jolana's going to show our slideshow. So, and we're going to basically, we'll coordinate the presentation. So Portuguese ao pé do berimbau. This is part of a project. If you go to the next slide, Jolana, the TLANG project, Translation and Translanguaging, funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council, principal investigator Angela Crease. Jolana and I were based in Leeds, and we were looking at a number of themes. We were looking at business, we were looking at sports, we were looking at heritage, we were looking at legal issues in terms of multilingual environments and basically using this concept of translanguaging. So the focus here in the sports factor, we focused on capoeira and basketball. So we're talking about the research which took place around the theme of capoeira. So thank you. Next slide. So we were looking at the communication in the capoeira sessions. They drew on a very wide range of modalities. There were nameable languages such as English and Portuguese, distinctive varieties of Portuguese, which have already been mentioned by Alan, such as Afro-Brazilian Portuguese. But not just that, also gesture and the body. So all of these modalities interact with and are regulated and supplemented by the modality of music. Interestingly, we didn't actually, in the phase of the research, it was only in writing this paper that we realized how important the modality of music is, because it kind of regulates everything that happens in the capoeira session, has the rhythm of the Jenga. So Jolana can do the moves. I only got to the Jenga. I have quite a passable Jenga. People would compliment me, but I never got to the moves. So I could sort of participate. So the rhythm sets the pace. We drew on the constructs of translanguaging, but also the notion of semiotic repertoire to capture these interactions and also see the whole in terms of Deleuze and Guattari's agencement or assemblage. Next slide, please. So for each phase of the session, Jolana's going to talk about this in more detail later, but just the broad brush at the moment. There was an expository phase where the contramestre Sandro, using both English explanation but Portuguese also, interacting with music, would take the group deep into cultural memory, embodied in apparently simple lyrics and stories, connecting them to the present, but also to the kind of values of capoeira. So it was a kind of acculturation into the capoeira scene, the capoeira space, the history. But in the second practice phase, again accompanied to music, the group practices moving singly or in pairs, and Sandro, the contramestre, circulates and uses an instructional register, drawing both on English and Portuguese, but also on gesture and the body to get people working on particular moves. So in the Roda phase, the instructional scaffold is removed, and well, not entirely removed, because even in the Roda, you can see, I think, from some of the videos, how the contramestre is still kind of somehow pushing things in a certain direction. But the jogadores try out their moves, their malandragem with each other, and the contramestre. So here in this phase, the body speaks. I'm going to talk about that later, through gesture and movement, expressing itself through nuances of the moves, which make up the regulated improvisation of the capoeira habitus. Next slide, please. So our research questions. We didn't, in our project, we weren't particularly looking at Portuguese learning or teaching. This was something that, it's been very interesting to do this because it's really brought us back to the data from a different angle. So when we started to write this paper, the present paper, we were interested, what opportunities or affordances does the Capoeira group offer for learning Portuguese? Are there differences in the way group members engage with this? Is Capoeira alone enough to attain fluency in Portuguese? And we didn't really need research to answer that question, but it was interesting to ask it and look at Capoeira. And finally, how can we understand learning through Capoeira as this verbal embodied musical assemblage? So not just language. Okay, next step. So
okay,
this is over.
Yeah, so I'm going to say just a few words about Capoeira in diaspora. So Delmont and Stevens, they use the term diaspora rather than globalization to talk about Capoeira, because diaspora implies an idea of homeland, which they argue is present in Capoeira. So furthermore, there are often strong links to Capoeira schools based in Brazil, such as in the case of the school that we were looking at in Leeds. So Capoeira reached London in 1985, according to Assunção 2005, and then it spread to other UK cities. And as a result of its African roots, Capoeira represents a specific aspect of Brazilian culture, and that is the Afro-Brazilian culture. Capoeira in Leeds. So in Leeds, the context is quite specific, I would say, because unlike in Manchester, there is no presence of the big Capoeira schools such as Cordão de Ouro or Senzala. Instead, there are two groups that are less common. So the first one is Guardiões do Brasil, and that's the Contramestre Negoteta or Sandro. So that is the group that we were studying, that we are looking at. And there is also Capoeira Club London, represented by Professor Zumbi. So there are these two schools. And quite interestingly, I believe there is no rivalry between the two schools, and many students attend both. We observed the classes of Contramestre Negoteta or Sandro. And at the time of observation, which was roughly 5-6 years ago, there were about 7 students in the class. I'm going to say a few things about Sandro because we believe it's understanding him, his person, his character is quite key to understand his style of capoeira and also the emphasis he puts on transmitting a certain kind of knowledge to his students. So he is from the south of Brazil, from Paraná, and he has trained in a range of capoeira styles, but describes his own style as capoeira de rua. So again, this is not very, I would say this is not the most regular style that you will come across. So it's a very, he incorporates some elements of self-defense and so on, but it is not the most common style of capoeira that you would come across. He's very concerned with passing on the knowledge about the history and philosophy of capoeira to his students. I can't really see. So Sandro originally learned capoeira as a child to avoid bullying, and I have included a quotation from an interview that I have done with him, and I think I'll read it in full. The reason why I started capoeira was to avoid bullying at school, because I was the only Black person at the school and the only fat person in the community. I was selling ice cream on the streets, on the trolley, and I saw some guys playing on just a neighborhood, just a small park, just kicking around, doing some backflips, doing some cartwheels. And I asked what that was, and they said, oh, this is capoeira. It was the only group of people who actually helped me without judging me for who I was. So for me, this is a very telling extract from that interview, because it really shows what capoeira has meant for Sandro. It was like a safe haven for him. I believe that's something that really formed him as a person. We also interviewed one of the students of Sandro, a lady called Sophie. Okay, I should also say that the person in the picture here is actually Sandro, because he was happy for us to use his real name. However, this lady here is not Sophie. Sophie is not her real name either, because we anonymized her. So Sophie is one of Sandro's students. She's originally from France, and she's fluent in Brazilian Portuguese, which she started learning because of capoeira. In the past, she had a Brazilian partner who helped her to learn Portuguese, but disapproved of the language associated with capoeira. So according to her ex-boyfriend, it wasn't pure Portuguese, you know. So his idea was like, oh, well, they're saying this, but it's not how it should be said, you know. He felt it wasn't correct Portuguese. So he felt it wasn't the Portuguese I should learn, you know. So again, we found this extract very interesting because it shows a stance, it shows the opposition of a correct or what is perceived as correct Portuguese and what is perceived as incorrect Portuguese, which is the Portuguese associated with capoeira. I must also say that Sophie in the interview later said that later on that she's still in touch with him. It's been a while, but they're still in touch. And he later changed his mind, and he's he's saying he was prejudiced. So over to Mike.
Okay, I just want to make a couple of comments about Sophie, Sandra and Sophie. In terms of Alan's remarks about the social and economic possibilities that open up, Sandra is an example of this, and his life story is fascinating. And it wasn't really the main focus of our study until we came back to the here. But he really is somebody who, through the sort of the globalization of capoeira, has sort of, and there are not many people around the world like him who've been able to make a life for themselves around running and doing capoeira. The second is the comment of Sophie's boyfriend. I thought that resonated with the highly nationalistic discourses comment of Leandro. This is a characteristic, the language around the pure language. We don't want the marginal, the language. So I think there's echoes with things that Alan and Leandro have been saying. So just to carry on, I think you're doing this section, aren't you, Yolana?
I can. Okay.
This is, I mean, this is an example of a song which Sandro presented and introduced to the group, and he had some very interesting comments on it, which I think we're going to look at, and you could maybe play that and talk about it. So.
Okay, so I really hope this is going to work.
If you sing a song, you need to put a fundament on that song, a meaning, sending a message to people on the song. A lot of people in these days, they get challenged by a singer and they don't know what that means. I come to you and I sing a song to you. You don't even bother of what I'm singing. And I come to the heart and I kick your head. Oh, why did you kick it? I told you I would. Or how? I sang a song telling you I would. You didn't listen to me. You didn't pay attention on the song. You got beaten. Like one of the songs, just one of them. It says, Vale-me Deus, Senhor São Bento, buraco velho tem cobra dentro. These are kind of songs, like, Vale-me Deus, like protect me God, and protect me Saint Benedict. São Bento is a saint who protects you against the snake bite. So, snake bite, or it means someone is biting, or the caprice is going to try to attack me. Buraco velho tem cobra dentro. The old hole on the floor may have a snake inside. When you sing this kind of song, maybe there's a really experienced guy in the roda playing with you. So I'm warning you, be aware because you are playing with a person with a lot of experience. So don't try him because it may be dangerous. He may not have the skills of hitting you fast. He may...
So just before we continue, I think what we get from the way Sandra was talking about the song is like, it gives you a message, like the smart, it's quite a tough school. I think his capoeira is quite a tough school. But the message, the song gives you a message to expect something. So he's training or explaining to people how they can read the songs and get the message from the songs. So it's a real sort of cultural building up of cultural knowledge, which he's doing in such an interesting way. Okay, we can carry on now. So I wanted just to talk a little bit about the framework, the translanguaging turn. So this is a shift from system and structure to practice, which have already been mentioned, I think, by Alan in his talk, towards disinventing language. I actually think languages have a robust social reality, so I'm not totally in favor of disinventing language, but the arguments are interesting. There's a focus on repertoire, and we're going to talk about this in a moment. There's an emphasis on translanguaging as language from below. Yeah, so it's not the sort of the powerful or statusful language, it's language from below. Potentially regulated by normative language ideologies, so which can endorse monolingualism or separate bilingualism, or indeed, as we saw in the comment from Sophie's boyfriend, a kind of an elite form or a dominant form of the language. Okay. So translanguaging repertoires, I'm going back to a definition by Spotty and the late lamented Jan Blommaert. So people perform repertoires of identities through linguistic semiotic resources, and the semiotic is very important here, acquired over the course of their life trajectories through membership or participation in various sociocultural spaces in which their identities are measured against normative centers of practice. So there's a kind of dimension of habit, the acquisition of habitus. Over a life course, we acquire these linguistic semiotic resources. So move on, please. I'm also going to bring in the notion of assemblage, which I mentioned already, to consider how diverse semiotic resources play a collaborative role as a spatial repertoire in accounting for the success of activity when language is not predefined as the sole, superior, or separate medium of communication. Assemblage corrects the orientation to non-verbal resources in scholars addressing multimodality. So from the perspective of assemblage, according to Kanagaraja, semiotic resources are not organized into separate modes. I have a problem with the use in English of assemblage. The term in French is agencement. I don't know how you do it in Portuguese. Agencement can both mean the process of bringing together and what is brought together. Assemblage loses the process dimension. So I do think there's a problem. So I prefer the term agencement to use it when I can. Okay, next slide, please. So this is the way we define translanguaging in this book of ours, T.K. Lee. It's a creative selection and combination of communication modes, verbal, visual, gestural, embodied, available in the speaker's repertoire. Translanguaging practices are locally occasioned, influenced and shaped by context, but also by the affordances of particular communication modes or combinations thereof. And Alan's given a very interesting account that you can't it's not having separate elements you bring together, that the relationship is created by the elements in the moment of their being brought together. It's much more organic and in time space, and I think that's a great point. Translanguaging practices, as we've said earlier, typically language from below, liable to be seen as infringing purist, monolingual, regulated bilingual language ideologies. And this can therefore be understood as speaking back explicitly or implicitly to these ideologies. I want to say a little, just for a moment, about the approach to the body, which I've got from the work of Judith Butler towards a performativity of assembly. This was the way which helped me think about the language-body interface. I don't know if anybody here has been watching the World Cup. I can't imagine that you would be, but if you were, you would know that the German squad made a protest against the banning of LGBT symbolism by covering their mouths. So covering the mouth, that is, it's more than a gesture. I would say it's more than a gesture, just like taking the knee in the basketball world in America and elsewhere is more than a gesture. It's actually, you're sort of committing your body in some way. And then one of the players who was interviewed said, denying us an armband is the same thing as denying us a voice. So the wearing of an armband speaks. It has a symbolism, it speaks. So this is what we mean when we talk about the interaction of language, the visual, the gestural, embodied. And there are some very interesting examples in the area of sport. Okay, that's a little bracket thing. Can we move on then, Yolana? So we developed the framework on translanguaging based on Jakobson's very well-known typology of translation. He talks about intralingual translation or rewording, which is like a question of register within a language. Interlingual, translation proper, as he called it, going across borders, across languages. Intersemiotic translation, which involves crossing semiotic boundaries. This was something he didn't particularly develop in his own work. So next slide. So basically, we transposed the Jakobson framework, interlingual, intralingual, intersemiotic, into translanguaging, but we also developed categories that are not envisaged by Jakobson, interdiscursive translanguaging, which I won't touch on today, but the language-body interface, which is important. And I would now want to add, we need to consider music as a modality which interacts with others in agencement assemblages. Okay, so where are we going now? Now this was the notion of enregistrement was brought in by one of our people who commented on the paper. And as soon as it was mentioned, I thought, yes, this has real possibility. So in capoeira, the Portuguese which is made available involves a register which is richly inflected with Afro-Brazilian language and culture. And it's not just a language, it's also songs, music, gesture. This is part of the package, though, the Portuguese language that might attract disapproval from mainstream ideology. For example, the comments quoted of Sophie's Brazilian ex. So if apprentice capoeiristas are learning a register, we can follow Alga and suggest that the process is one of enregistrement. However, the idea we have of register here is not a narrowly linguistic one, because it does involve this coordination of visual, verbal, musical, embodied, and other elements in an assemblage. And I find this is probably, if the next obvious thing to do from this paper will be to think more about enregistrement in relationship to language learning, but I'll say something about that at the end. Okay. So capoeira, as we put it as an additional language, is not just about language, but about acquiring a register organized as an assemblage comprised of its visual, verbal, and embodied musical elements. The process that the novice capoeirista embark on is a process of enregistrement. Okay. So Yolana.
Yeah, okay, so I'm just going to give a quick overview of language, or probably I should say modalities that were used at different stages of capoeira classes. So as Mike mentioned, the classes followed a general pattern. There was expository phase, there was a practice phase, and then at the end there was usually a bit of a roda, which is more like a free practice. Okay, so upon arrival and during the breaks, there was always a lot of informal chatting. Yeah, the group is a very friendly one. Some of the people have known each other for many, many years. This chatting was mostly in English, but native speakers and those fluent in Portuguese used Portuguese. And there was also some English and Portuguese translanguaging present. In the expository phase, which is the phase when Sandro would mostly give a context, or he would teach us about the history of capoeira or Brazilian history, the explanations would be mostly in English, but when songs were discussed, those were in Portuguese, the songs in Afro-Brazilian Portuguese. And during this phase, Sandro often tests the student understanding and knowledge of some of the key Portuguese terms. So when we come across a song, he would test your knowledge of the vocabulary in the song. In the practice phase, so when the students actually started to practice, the simple instructions were mostly in Portuguese, such as troca, for change. But the more complex instructions were in English, and they were accompanied by gestures and embodied communication. In the Roda phase, the Roda is accompanied by songs which are sung in Afro-Brazilian Portuguese, and of course there is the actual game within the Roda, so we have the conversation of the capoeira buddies. Quite often, especially the workshops, but sometimes even the classes were followed by social events or a quick drink. We observed 2 workshops which were led by visiting mestres who were Brazilians based in other UK cities, and they were followed by drinks or socializing. And what we observed was that the visiting mestres preferred to communicate in Portuguese on these occasions, and Sandro was he was typically translating into English. So next, let's have a look at our research question number 2, which was how do different group members engage with these opportunities or affordances? And also at research question number 3, is capoeira alone enough to attain fluency in Portuguese? So beginner capoeiristas usually start learning Portuguese mostly by acquiring lexemes related to capoeira. So that is the names of the instruments, berimbau, pandeiro, names of the movements, ginga or au, or simple instructions like troca. And they are also expected to sing the chorus of the songs. Yeah, so the chorus quite often repeats what the lead singer sings. So quite often it is based on repetition rather than producing actively the language. So advancing from the stage of the beginner, the one that I have described earlier, the stage when the capoeirista knows the lexemes related to capoeira, to a deeper knowledge of the language can be a challenge, as our research suggests. Still, from our observations, it became apparent that some of the students can effectively communicate in Portuguese. So next, I will hopefully show you a video of one of the students who was a French capoeirista, and not Sophie, but a different French capoeirista. And it shows how she responds to the mestres apology in Portuguese. Okay, so I won't play the, okay.
Well done.
Okay, so we can see that the maestro has accidentally kicked her, and he apologized in Portuguese, also using gestures which were typical, let's say, non-capoeirista gestures, just typical everyday gestures, and she responds in Portuguese. She said, I think, tá bom. I'm trying to go to the next slide. Oops, yes, okay. So we were looking at how different people engage with the language learning affordances. And we just demonstrated that some of the students are fluent in Portuguese, excuse me. Whereas I would say the majority of the students were not, and they spoke Portuguese to a varying extent. I would like to contrast Sophie with another student who was George. So Sophie is an example of somebody who is fluent in Portuguese. She's able to read it and she can watch films in Portuguese. George is an advanced capoeirista. Excuse me, he has no problems understanding Portuguese in the context of the classes. He can lead a roda, which means he can be the lead singer. He can sing, he understands the songs he's singing. However, he has difficulties using Portuguese in everyday situation. So he has not really progressed from using Portuguese within the closed context of capoeira to let's say, to take it outside the context of capoeira. So Sophie is a native French speaker, also speaks some Spanish and English. George is a native English speaker who speaks some German because that's his partner's mother tongue. So as we can see, they both speak another language. Sophie, interestingly, has never been to Brazil. George has spent 1 month in Brazil. However, he said he couldn't really connect with it. So he spent one month mostly traveling with his partner. He has visited different places. However, he told me he's always felt a little bit out of his comfort zone, couldn't really connect to the place. Sophie is very interested in Brazilian popular culture, such as music, films, and so on. George is not particularly interested in Brazilian popular culture. Sophie has experienced a period of time when she was exposed to Brazilian culture. As we mentioned, she had her ex-boyfriend she had a Brazilian boyfriend. For George, apart from the trip to Brazil, he hasn't experienced a period of time when he was exposed to Brazilian culture for an extended period of time. So I believe that this personal characterization to an extent explains their language achievements. So for me, what really makes a difference is the fact that Sophie is really interested in Brazilian culture. She's interested in the culture beyond the context of capoeira. Whereas George, he's quite happy he is learning Portuguese for capoeira. He thinks it would be nice to communicate with other Portuguese speakers, but really his main focus is Portuguese for capoeira. So is capoeira alone enough to attain fluency in Portuguese? As Mike mentioned, we already suggested the answer. So our findings also suggest that it is not. Capoeira can be the reason why people start learning the language, but it needs to be complemented by other forms of language learning. It can also expand the language and culture knowledge of those who already speak some Portuguese. And we have observed that advancing to a level of Portuguese when students can use the language actively can be a challenge, as we have demonstrated with the case study of George. So we would also like to discuss briefly an initiative by the Brazilian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, which is the a proposal of of Portuguese for capoeiristas. The Brazilian Ministry of Foreign Affairs has developed study materials which can be used to bridge this gap and support the learning of Portuguese. And while we believe that this initiative is certainly highly relevant and valuable, its focus was different from the focus of our study. So while the MR initiative looks at the language mostly in isolation, in our research, we look at language from the perspective of translanguaging and as one of the modalities used in communication, alongside other modalities such as music and semiotic repertoire, such as gestures, Afro-Brazilian Portuguese, and so on. And we also connect translanguaging to the idea of enregistrement. Okay, over to Mike.
So we started this study with a relatively simple question, which is how could capoeira in diaspora provide a context for Portuguese learning, in particular an Afro-Brazilian variety of Portuguese? But the idea of translanguaging led us to examine the complex interaction of language and embodied action and eventually music in capoeira practice. It began to be seen reductionist, simply to see capoeira as an occasion for Portuguese learning. And in fact, Sandro said this at one point, Iolana, if you'll recall, he was saying, oh, it's not really Portuguese because you're learning lots of aspects of things from African languages. It's actually much more diverse just than Portuguese. So for that reason, we began to see the capoeira practice, as we've said, as a semiotic register assembled from the variety of semiotic modes in play, including from different language varieties. And from that point, capoeira learning and language learning as a part of it is a form of enregistrement. Next slide. So I think we've mentioned this already. I think that capoeira is not sufficient for learning Portuguese of itself, but it can be a jumping off point towards fluency for some people, not for others. But we certainly see the potential for engagement with capoeira to deepen Portuguese learning more generally. So probably in language learning terms, a combination of exposure to Portuguese through capoeira with other ways of learning would be the most effective. I just wanted to finish. Basically, our research was actually linguistic ethnographic or sociolinguistic. We weren't actually asking ourselves, well, what are the implications for teaching and learning? So I think it poses a kind of very interesting question about what is, if sociolinguistic research finds something, how can this be transformed into pedagogical practice? So I would say the challenge for the semiotic repertoire is for teachers and learners to start thinking of language not just in terms of the language forms or even the functions or whatever. It's about the way language operates in context in a local way. I'm reminded, I was thinking about this back in the day, a long time, possibly before some people here were born. Speech act theory came along, and that wasn't even from linguistics, it was from philosophy, but it became tremendously influential in turning around language teaching. So I think now we have a challenge, which is how do we develop pedagogies? And I think Alan has already mentioned this, Alan and Dinesh, Leandro. How can we develop pedagogies that can answer to or resonate with the ways we're now thinking about language and move language learning and language teaching on a step or two? So that's really, I think, the challenge. Thank you very much. Okay. So we can close our PowerPoint. Here we are.
Yes.
Thank you very much, Jolana and Mike. This was amazing because you moved on from the text, so it is great. So can I now invite Kathy to start with her discussion, which we are all looking forward to.
Yes, that's fine. Can you all hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Yes, we can. Yes,
Okay.
please
Okay, great. Okay, I don't have any PowerPoint or any slides to show. I'm just going to talk. So I hope that's okay. Is everything sort of set up all right? All right?
Yeah, it's
Okay.
all, everything is fine. Thank you, Kathy. Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, start.
All right. Okay. Thank you so much for the invitation to this exciting event and to the launch of your wonderful collection. It's nice to try to picture you all in Sao Paulo, enjoying time in each other's presence, physically at last, but it's also nice to see those of you online in different parts of the world. And many thanks to Mike and Yolanda for this beautiful article and presentation, which has given me, and I'm sure all of us, so much to think about. I just want to sort of start off by mentioning a point that they didn't make in the presentation, but is in the paper. And I'm sure those of you who have read or will read the paper will pick up on this, that about the origins in slavery of capoeira, and a sort of a kind of very tentative mention of the word capoeira in the indigenous Tupi word apuamira, which means a young forest in a place that had previously been cleared. And I loved to think of this while reading the paper. This was a place where runaway slaves practiced their fight skills, as well as the place where they would ambush those sent by their masters to capture them. I love this idea of the young forest in the place that had previously been cleared. I think the sort of, all sorts of resonances with that idea. So Mike and Yolanda's paper circles around the idea that in the context of increased diasporic migration and mobility, it's worth exploring new approaches to language learning, which build on informal contextual and social approaches, possibly drawing on authentic language, bringing the outside in, learning in the wild. Capoeira offers a fascinating site for exploring these ideas. However, as Mike and Yolanda delved more deeply into how languaging, I would call it, takes place in the activities of the group, they started to see how difficult it became to focus on language in isolation from everything else going on in capoeira, the music, the movements, the rhythms, the cultural history, and so on. By taking us through the routines of capoeira classes, these entanglements are revealed in their beautifully detailed ethnographic descriptions, moment by moment. Surrounding this core to the paper, Yolanda and Mike trace something of the history of capoeira, with its roots in the slavery and the savagery of the slave trade, a period of illegality of capoeira and its take-up by street gangs to its widespread current popularity. The authors also trace the very moving stories, and we saw some elements of that, of the contramestre Sandro, his own personal struggles, and how he came to capoeira and its teaching. In working with their research focus, which was the affordances of capoeira classes in schools, they explore with great care and caution what a transition to a more active production of language on the part of students could involve. And they suggest that while this could focus on ways of enhancing language learning opportunities and making them more systematic and available, as that formal curriculum that you saw from the ministry is trying to do, but they also argue that pulling the language out of the assemblage would render it something else. And they suggest that approaching language learning as a process of acquiring a register that is organized as an assemblage involving its visual, verbal, and embodied elements. So Mike and Yolanda work with a number of key conceptual frames, and they make some important theoretical moves, which I will try to draw out. The first is what Mike and Lee call the maximalist understanding of translanguaging, which they have explained in their talk. This takes us beyond the more common usage of the term interlingual and intralingual, and into the dimension where the prefix trans can also mean beyond, above, beyond, in the sense of above and beyond language, involving the intersemiotic. In this case, translanguaging therefore applies to other communicative modalities, the visual, sound, music, possibly the spatial and the gestural. I'm a little cautious about how we think about the body in this. I know that Mike has suggested this could be part of this bigger framing of maximalist translanguaging. I think we need to maybe think about that a little bit more. But this widening of the usage of the term enables the authors to reveal the entanglement and the inextricability of the different modalities of communication. This leads us then on to the next frame that they draw on, which is the concept of assemblage. And here they draw on Kanagaraja to argue for a view of semiotic resources as part of spatial repertoires, which come together in this process of agencement, as Mike prefers to call it, in such a way that they can no longer be organized or possibly thought of as separate modes, thus the assemblage. So here the concept of assemblage is being used to explain the entanglement of modes of communication. And I want to note here and return to this point later that this is a somewhat different way of using the concept assemblage from how it has been taken up in socio-material approaches and also in post-humanist or new materialist approaches. And I'll return to that. And then a further frame that Mike and Jolana draw on, which is implied in the way the concept of assemblage is being used, is the understanding of language as social practice involving resources, repertoires, and registers. This understanding of language marks a sharp move away from a view of language as structure and system. Through these moves and frames, the authors suggest that what they're doing is perhaps related to Marconi and Pennycook's disinventing language, although Mike in his presentation you've made that a little bit more, you've been a bit more cautious about that, Mike, and I completely understand your caution. In Marconi and Pennycook's work on disinventing language, they comment on the limitations of current conceptualizations of multilingualism, which they argue continue to rely on language as conceptualized as bounded countable entities. Drawing on pre-colonial conceptions of language, especially from Africa, they argue that to see language in this way is to adopt the ways of thinking of colonialism. I think that the paper and capoeira itself offers us a very privileged view into rethinking how Portuguese can be conceptualized differently, for example, in the ways in which Sandro refuses almost, I think he's refusing to see Portuguese as Portuguese in his classes, instead drawing on its sort of Afro-Brazilian fusion and its elements of Yoruba and Creole, which he mentions in one of the pieces of data. So before making comment on the affordance of capoeira classes for language learning, I want to raise a few questions about how capoeira gets recontextualized across time and space from the possibly hundreds of years ago, from the young forest in the clearing in the forest, through the street gangs, through the period of illegality, to the streets of Brazil and favelas of Brazil today, to the curriculum and to a variety of classes in schools across the world. I see Jolana and Mike's paper is mostly taking a synchronic approach in the current conjuncture, where they look at it as it is happening now, when at a time when capoeira is to some extent being exported, possibly becoming more didactic and possibly even commodified. Forgive me if I misrepresent it here. I hope I'm just suggesting this, I'm not arguing it. Of course, I wouldn't know. And I'm wondering whether by trying to take a more diachronic approach, we might see threads in the present that may bring us around to some different ways, even further different ways of thinking about language, about what a concept that I'm thinking with about, which called unthinking language, rather than disinventing it. And the play on the word unthinking language is deliberate. In doing this, I found myself wanting to try out different frames and moves for thinking about capoeira while reading their paper. For example, what would a socio-material reading of it reveal? What would a decolonial reading of it involve? What would an affective reading of it involve? What would a reading informed by post-humanism or new materialist theory involve? And the approach that I'm most interested in at the moment, what would a reading informed by the emerging frameworks of what's called language materiality and language ontologies reveal? Such readings could cast some light, perhaps, on the dilemmas that Mike and Jolana experienced as they put into place the different frames and moves to answer their research questions, and which they have both illustrated so beautifully and transparently some of the questions and dilemmas. And this may also allow this idea of different readings, and I'm suggesting them with great tentativeness because I think it's a very, very beautiful paper, but I'm wondering whether perhaps different readings could take into account more of the data than the current frames seem to be allowing. But a few initial observations. First, I have some reservations about the use of the term translanguaging for the intersemiotic dimension and where this takes us. I find myself wondering if it is adequate to the task that it needs to do. We're taking the word translanguaging and applying it to these different modes. And it's trying to explain how we can conceptualize language in relation to these other modes of communication, as well as the material and the spatial. I'm reminded of Brian Street's early difficulties with the extension of the term literacy to the concept of multiliteracies, which he felt reified channel of communication, applying the concept of literacy, for example, to the visual or the body or whatever, the gestural. When Brian preferred his idea of multiple literacies, rather, which helped us understand literacy as social practice within domains of practice, like the family, religion, the school, the marketplace, and so on. So I wonder whether this extension of the approach is happening in order to deal with a sort of anomaly in the theory, and whether it's a close enough fit to explain what's going on in capoeira. Secondly, while the concept of assemblage and agencement is very valuable in the way it's applied here, it's not quite the same as how it would be applied if it were used in a socio-material or, for example, post-humanist approach. Here, Mike and Yolanda are using the concept to conceptualize how modes of communication become entangled, and the focus is on communication, become entangled and inextricable from each other. Whereas in a socio-material or a post-human, perhaps, approach, the concept is often used to explore how the human is intertwined with what can be called other ontological entities, like non-human animals or plants or material objects or infrastructure and so on. This is this shift away from the human. It involves a consideration of how we move beyond human-centered approaches towards understanding humans in relation to these other ontological entities, we could call them. So in the next section, I just want to try and push this a little bit further. We're very cautiously, and I'm just going to try two examples of possible different readings of the data, and this is really conjectural, and I hope not really inappropriate, but different readings of the data to cast light on approaches which might draw on some different frames and moves. So one example I thought about, maybe to think differently about the song that you told us, that you explained to us so beautifully, but the song about the snake in the hole. That story takes on a very different, and I don't know what to call it, other than perhaps a different ontology, when Sandro explains how it plays a role. It relies on very deep idiom, which requires engaging with in ways that are often not accessible to those who might have been educated in Western systems. If you think, it requires thinking that a snake might bite you, nothing unusual about that, but that something like the bite might come from a person attacking you in the capoeira. The snake then becomes a person, and you have to make that shift as the capoeira player. But perhaps that person was originally a snake way back in a different time. And then the old hole signifies that the attacker is older. So the attacker needs to be thought about in possibly very material ways, the snake in the hole, and then translated into the current events that are happening in the game, to use the term they use. So these are not very linear meaning-making processes, but they seem to involve analogies which are very visual. And this idiom suggests not other ways of thinking, but an apprehension perhaps of other ways of being, in which perhaps humans are connected with animals and physical matter in processes that might be quite hard for many of us to grasp. At the same time, a charm is invoked for protection, and that in itself references perhaps the introduction of Catholicism in the form of St. Benedict, possibly the taking hold of idioms of Western religion into very different, possibly originally shamanic practices or forms of ancestral religion. Thinking of this, slaves having come from Africa and so on, whole Afro-Brazilian connection. And then the very repetition and the rhythm of the song might contribute to the ways of understanding it. So I'm not saying that the repetition and rhythm come together with language and so on, but that they are absolutely, they don't contribute to each other, they structure each other, which are different. And Mike, you did mention this about how the importance of the music. I found myself wondering a lot about that, as well as about rhythm. I know you might think about rhythm as a mode. I'm wondering about it slightly differently, and I'm not sure if I'm making that clear. And these may be very different ways of learning from those which have relied on understandings of language as structuralist and immaterial, based on the original idea of the arbitrary relations between signifieds and signifiers. So with regard to capoeira, in the deep past of such a strange song, there might have been very different ways of being, which through his apprenticeship, Sandro has somehow gained access to in the present. So a possible different reading, I mean, it's maybe very impudent of me to even consider this, but I'm wondering how perhaps a diachronic approach might reveal different readings of this. Let me also try this approach with regard to the music and the rhythm in the rondo. The title of your paper gives us an important hint, learning at the feet of the berimbau. And this is interesting. Of course, it can simply be a metaphor for apprenticeship, learning from someone literally above you. And this term is often used, I learn at your feet. But perhaps there's more to this idea of the feet. Could the berimbau itself have had feet and therefore agency as it moved to the clearing in the forest? Perhaps the person carrying and playing the berimbau became one and the same thing as the berimbau. What other roles did it play in perhaps originally many years ago summoning spirits or calling animals? And what about the low note? I think it was called the gringua, which seems essential to the start of the game, that very low note. How does the low note resonate in the bodies of those assembled and therefore become embodied? And how does the rhythm itself structure the event, with the clapping enabling the group to turn into one resonant, literal circle in which individuals might lose their individualness? Of course, these are all conjecture, but I'm just hoping that this might cast some new kind of forms of light on it. So to come back to language learning and the moves and frames that they're working with, they suggest that pulling language out of the assemblage renders it something else. So I think I'm asking, how does what is called the ontological turn, which I've drawn a little bit on above, how does it enable us to maybe think about what that something else is when it's pulled out of the assemblage? And I'm hoping that I'm hinting at some of this. So some of us working in decoloniality find it helpful to differentiate between different ways in which the term language is used. Love's distinction between first order and second order language is worth considering, because the first order embodied and processual. First order language is an experiential flow that is enacted, maintained, and changed by the real-time activity of participants, and often seen as languaging or language practices. And many of you will recognize Maturana and Veronelli in such thoughts, such ideas. Whereas the second order refers to the idea of a denotational code-like system of abstracta that can be separated from embodied and affective dynamics. And this is sometimes referred to as language with a capital L. Thibault argues that to construe this flow as sequences of abstract forms is a radical misconstrual of what people are doing in their languaging. And that he means a problem emerges when we mistake the second order, the abstract system, for what is happening when people use language in the real world, as he puts it. So I'm just going to try and skim a little bit here. So that can be applied to multilingualism, but I'll leave that for the moment, that idea. But I think linguistic anthropology is bringing up some very thought-provoking approaches drawing on this ontological turn. Huck and Heinrich argue that in the efforts to overcome the conceptual gap between languaging and what language is in that sense, the second order concept, much research has shifted the focus away from language towards semiosis, discourse, performance, and related concepts. But they suggest that bypassing the question of a definition of language and confining our theoretical frameworks to concepts such as semiosis or action removes our analysis even further away from the phenomena we are observing. We're simply transferring the problem of linguistic ideological difference to another level. So they suggest an ontological approach, which isn't seen as an alternative to language ideological approach, but they suggest that the language ideological approach might leave the object language of inquiry intact. And I just want to mention some of the work of Magnus Kors, who works on the edge of Chile and Argentina amongst the Mapuche people, in his article entitled Words Beyond Meaning in Mapuche Language Ideology. Having worked amongst the Mapuche, Kors finds himself asking if Mapudungun, the language of the Mapuche people, and Spanish are two different kinds of the same thing, or are they two different things? Entering deeply into his Mapuche interlocutors' thinking through many years of ethnographic research, his writing starts to bring us back to the first and second order language. when asking, are there two different kinds of the same thing, he starts to say, if we see this as a language ideological debate, we may be skating around the question of what language is. The ethnographic work showed that certain practices, especially ritual practices, and I think this is of relevance to capoeira, had to be carried out in Mapudungun, not in Spanish. He shows how this can be argued through on the basis of a language ideological position, but he's convinced that's not enough. He thus argues that Spanish, unlike other non-Mapuche languages, is understood as an arbitrary and fungible system of representation. Mapudungun, on the other hand, is understood as deeply and fundamentally attached to the very fabric of the world. Spanish is, he says, to Mapudungun as symbol is to index. While they are both classified as speech, Spanish is white people's speech, while Mapudungun is the speech of the land. For the Mapuche, language carries a force in excess and beyond that of the speaker's intent. It's distinct from what the speaker and beyond his or her control. The term nuan, or force, is singular and multiple and refers to a multiplicity of forces inherent in and constitutive of the world. So Course argues that the Peircean, he moves on to Peircean semiotics, which is very influential in the ontological term. The concept of index is fundamentally about meaning, but he argues that while Mapudungun bears meaning, it does more than that. It has an excess, a force irreducible to meaning. He then comes around to argue that Mapudungun and Spanish are both two different versions of the same thing, and they are different things. So I want to just try and bring this back to language ideologies and to some of the questions about language learning, to language ontologies now, not language ideologies. So in a recent paper I've been working on, we identify sort of three different language ontologies, sort of Saussurian structural linguistics, which could be seen as an essentialist language ideology based on the principle of arbitrariness. A second non-essentialist ideology would look at meaning as having central weight and seeing language as constructing meaning in practice. This suggests to a shift in language study where indexicality replaces denotation as the more encompassing dimension of social action. And this work has led to the vast body of work on language ideologies, which has been so influential in the field of multilingualism, and has led to powerful ways of conceptualizing power and domination as these are played out in language policies and practices. A third ontology of language could be this idea about assemblages. And here there are two ways of thinking about the assemblage. The one where we think about language in relation to other modes of communication. But again, we might be not thinking sufficiently enough about language, but rather about language in relation to other modes of communication. Or the other one, the more socio-material approach, where we think about human communication in relation to other ontological types. But I believe that the work of Course and others, I'm nearly finished now, who are drawing on frameworks of language materiality and language ontologies, or might be pointing to another language ontology, one which goes beyond the above, the three that I've been talking about. One which foregrounds language as both indexical and iconic. And I'm wondering whether it might be possible to think of some of the uses of capoeira and the languaging that's going on in this way. And this may be a reason why capoeira would resist systematization and opportunities for further language learning. It may be possible to examine the data further by thinking about it through this way of thinking about language as both as indexical and as iconic itself. While I've tried to sort of take us on a sort of a journey through some different ways of perhaps looking at what's happening in capoeira, I do come back to the same sort of idea of Michael Nyolana, that in the end, I agree that capoeira cannot really provide a space for the kind of additional language learning that we traditionally think of. And I agree that language learning can be experienced as enregisterment, but I'm wondering whether it's possibly enregisterment into an ontology of language that might be at different or at odds with some of the ontologies of language that students might already be holding. So those are just some sort of very broad kind of thoughts in response to this sort of very beautiful, meticulous work that is embodied that is represented in the paper. And I hope that you found them interesting.
Absolutely. And if I could just briefly respond before we go into a more general mode. I mean,
Please
a
do.
characteristically brilliant summary that Kathy's provided. And I love the directions she's pointed us into. One point about these sort of the three moves, as it were, in sort of understanding language. I think performativity is incredibly important. And I would, so for me, that would be the move after. Indexicality is purely on the level of the semiotic meaning making. Performativity takes it out into the world somehow. And that's what I think is important.
Yes.
But the diachronic, I think, is so important. I mean, we didn't, Sandra wasn't really a focus in the study. We were really looking at things, but as soon as you start to look at Sandra, I mean, his life story is breathtaking. I mean, just simply a paper which was around the way he kind of constructed his life, but also the way he was absolutely committed to making visible things you're talking about in the story and the songs. As soon as you mentioned the sort of the post-humanist, I immediately thought of that Snake song, because there's, you know, it's incredibly rich. And I think you did a wonderful job in unpacking it.
Okay, thanks.
So no, I absolutely enjoyed your talk. I hope is it written down? I hope it's available for us to sort of.
It's almost there, so I can just do a bit of tweaking and I can circulate it then, as well as a couple of references, perhaps.
Please do.
Thanks.
Well, anyway, thank you very much.
Okay.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you, Kathy. I mean, this was brilliant, and it actually brings us to a new dimension. Jolana, would you like to say something here?
I would just like to say, Kathy, thank you so much. That was just fascinating. That was brilliant. And yeah, I hope that this is going to be written down, so this is going to be available. I was just making notes as I was listening to you, and yeah, so I think the whole idea of commodifying capoeira is quite an important one, because, and also I think it also applies to language learning, because I believe in this kind of commodified way of capoeira teaching and learning. The traditional language learning might be a little bit easier to kind of to add to. So I know that some capoeira schools, they do language learning classes that actually precede the actual capoeira class, which is something quite different from incorporating the language learning within the capoeira class, which I believe is something that's extremely challenging. And also the language learning, again, focuses on, let's say, the named language as Portuguese, whereas within the classes, the focus is on a different sort of language. And it was fascinating to listen to you to describe that sort of language as a language that's full of symbolism, that is embodied. So yeah, I think that's where the challenge lies.
Thanks. Right. I mean, I think one thing I didn't, sorry, Clara, just to sort of respond to those two, and then we open it up, was so Mike, and I mean, I'm interested in the way you're both working with the sort of concept of the body. And I think maybe, Mike, your concept of performativity is valuable there, and lets us maybe think differently ontologically. But I don't see, I think your focus is a lot on communication, modes of communication in capoeira. And I sort of wonder whether we aren't limiting ourselves by thinking about that. So when I think about something as embodied, I don't think about it as any longer. I used to. I mean, obviously the gestural is a mode of communication. It indexes clearly in the deictic sense. But I think embodiment, we can think about it somehow differently, you know. And if I think about, which you didn't mention in the presentation, Sandro's incredible experiences of being shot, being stabbed, being beaten with a bottle to the point that his stomach kind of was cut open. And then the wider history of capoeira and how it comes from the savagery of slavery with its lashing and branding, mutilating and so on, and how those how the you know, the sort of diachronic view lets us understand something about that history. I don't know how that's then taken through into the present. You know, maybe when capoeira is practiced sort of, I hate to use the word, but like in situ more. Like I think we saw it, Mike, in 2017 in the favela. We saw a sort of a performance, a game, didn't we? And you know, it sort of feels different from when it's taken into a classroom of some kind. And one wonders how the kind of carrying of those threads of that embodied kind of history gets taken through into the movements as well. So, I mean, I don't quite know what I'm getting at there, but it's a sort of a hesitation about how we talk about embodiment in relation to the concept of multiple modes of, you know, different modes of communication within the assemblage, without always focusing on the human-centered and so on.
Yeah, I agree. We talk about the history dimension largely because we felt it might be a bit sort of impertinent to tell a Brazilian audience about the capoeira, although it is in the paper, obviously.
Yeah,
but yeah, I think
absolutely.
there's loads to explore, a number of different angles.
I also wanted to say that the let's say dark history of capoeira that you're referring to, the period of illegality, from my experience, I really wonder how Alan feels about that. From my experience, some capoeira schools, they completely leave that information out. The references of capoeira being used for street fights and so on. I think the fact that I have trained with Sandro and that we observed Sandro, who is very open to this, and he admits it, and he sees it as a valid part of the practice. It's part of its history. He doesn't deny it. However, it can be attached to stigma. So there was a time when capoeira was stigmatized for this reason. Therefore, there is this effort to kind of distance from those things. So Alan, what would you say?
Yolanda is inviting me to this conversation because I was also a capoeira practitioner, and yeah, I totally agree that in this process of like becoming globalized, capoeira was kind of cleaned up from part of its history and part of its contradictions, and also issues that could raise could be sensitive in relation to capoeira. As for example, capoeira has a strong connection with Afro-Brazilian religions, but this connection is kind of erased from this more globalized capoeira that we can see around the world. And for example, I think when you are talking, Kati, about like this process of being in a sense enregistered in capoeira, so as an ontological change in how you are, I could remind, for example, some of my first experiences in capoeira that were of changing your own self. So how do you feel about yourself? How do you are in a collective being? So you are not anymore just yourself. Maybe Yolanda could talk a bit about this when you are like practicing, for example, for many hours, or when you have workshops for many days, and then you are in a kind of different state of mind, that you are connected with the other people collectively, and you are not just yourself. You are connected with all the feelings that are around in a group of capoeira.
Alan, I think you train harder than me, and that's all I have to say to that.
The impression I get from talking to Sandro and also reading what he said in conversations with Yolanda, he trained in a pretty rough school. He was in a pretty rough school, and there's an element of that kind of rawness and roughness comes out in his classes. I'm thinking about the razor. Sometimes there are sort of things, he just kind of brings a flavor of the street into the. He's a very interesting guy to work with, I think.
So Kati, Mike, and Yolana, we have a question here from Margaret Schlatter about this idea of attaining fluency in Portuguese. So I can read it here. Thank you for your article. I'd like to understand what concept of attaining fluency in Portuguese you have in mind. It seems that it goes back to a linguistic-only perspective when the answer is yes or no, considering both participants mentioned, to is capoeira alone enough locally to attain fluency? Could the answer be different if you consider language use, learning, experiencing certain uses, and being able to participate? I think also it brings a connection with the discussion that we are making here.
To me, fluency is a kind of shorthand expression, and when you unpack it as what was the questioner's name?
Margarita.
When it was unpacked, when Margarita unpacked it, that's exactly what I think. So I completely agree with it.
So do I. It's very simplified. It's the way we present it. The idea of fluency is very simplified. I believe what I understand by fluency is the idea of being able to use Portuguese actively outside the context of capoeira. But yeah, I do agree with you that there is much more to it than just that.
Can I say something?
Yeah.
Thank you. The idea is, I think it's always a concern and difficult, right, to talk about learning outside the context where it happens, and also having in mind that people have certain reasons to learn, right? And when you bring all this linguistic aspects, right, with other modes of communication, these people, they are learning to use Portuguese with all these other modes in this specific context, and to participate there, right? Mm-hmm. So I think, and you said so, that I don't remember the guy's name, the participant's name. Sorry? George, yeah. That you could say that George is proficient, right, in his use of, or he is fluent to participate in the roda de capoeira, right? So why would you want him to be fluent in other contexts? This is what I think is not something that we should ask, because this is not the point. So why would we look at what's the other girl's name? Sophie. Why would we say that Sophie is more proficient than George? Because then you are looking at other things. You're not looking at what they want to participate in, right? So. Yeah, go ahead, Mike. I'm sorry.
This is true, Margarita, but in a way, what we were doing is trying to ask ourselves, well, does everybody get enthusiastic about Portuguese through learning capoeira? And clearly not. Some people are very happy with leading the roda is basically very participating. And you're quite right. There's no reason why he should learn any more. I'm learning Arabic for poetry purposes. I'm interested in reading Arabic.
Exactly. That's it. So with this, so if you ask this question, I think you fall back in this idea of a very of named languages and of only of a proficiency perspective that I don't think we want here. I don't know.
Yeah, absolutely. I can just I really agree with the fact that the reason to start a language, that should really be the starting point. However, every time I was talking to George, he felt very, very frustrated with himself. And the thing is that to be an advanced capoeirista, it requires proficiency to read in Portuguese. Lots of the books are written in Portuguese. It requires proficiency to talk to the old masters in English. So the reason I see him as not sufficiently fluent, let's say, it's his own frustration, because that is really what's stopping him from advancing to the next level, let's say.
I think this is an important point, you know, that maybe you can always, maybe you could bring up, because so to be proficient as a participant in capoeira is more than what he what he is able to do. This is what you're saying, because the question, I think the question is broad, you know, it is too broad to understand that you are talking about capoeira and not about, you know, being proficient.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, I think that's it. It's an interesting discussion because it parallels with what Kati is pointing out in relation to learning a language and going beyond what is to learn a language. So actually, like learning capoeira, it involves learning a language, but it goes far beyond from what is to learn a language. So and that's the question, because you have like a process of completely changing a subject by the means of participating in capoeira. So the person becomes another person. So that's an interesting way of looking at this at this issue.
Yeah, and I would say that to learn how to participate in capoeira has to do with all these modes, right? So because if you only study Portuguese, the linguistic aspect of Portuguese, you will not be able to participate, right? This is what I mean, you know. In fact, you are looking to you are looking at a participation that is, you know, a performance, and is a lot of, a mix of modes, you know, all together. And then when you want to talk about proficiency, you just look at the linguistic aspects. No, I mean, this is not, you know, it's not fair, because it's much more. So I'm not a capoeira player, and I guess I speak Portuguese well, okay? But I will never be proficient in this capoeira, jogo da capoeira. Yeah?
I think we agree. I think we agree, Margareta, broadly.
Yes.
Yeah.
Which means that it is relocated into a different thing, which is learning capoeirês, not necessarily Portuguese. And then if you think about learning capoeirês, you are actually simultaneizing the whole process and the whole dynamics. And, you know, you might ontologically lose, you know, you're trying to make hostage whatever is happening, that becomes, you know, it make hostage of the whole complex ontological issues which are at stake in your own ethnography and in the activity itself. So but yes, it's much more than learning Portuguese in itself. Yeah, it's much more than learning capoeirês either. So I'm not sure what you might want to say about this, but yeah.
Can I come in? Can I come in?
Yes.
I'm also just wondering a bit about sort of written language. You know, what happens, you know, we think about how previously unwritten languages become codified through their writing, through their being written down. through the development of orthographies and so on. So that turns it into, often in that process, the language becomes enregistered in that essentialist ontology of language, because it's often, in the way it's written down, it's often written down in a kind of a structural, systematic kind of way. And then the dangers to that, in a sense of the kind of the unintended consequences of that happening, mean that the loss to the way the language might have been conceptualized a different ontology of language, which could, for example, be connected to the land, or connected to the ancestors, or I don't know what it might be. There are unintended consequences in these things. So if we think about capoeira and how it could become, perhaps through processes of commodification and so on, formalized, but that what the unintended consequences of that might be as that starts to happen. I'm not sure if I'm making myself very clear, but yeah.
I'm thinking, while you're talking about the focus on where the kind of the space where capoeira originally happened, which was in the sort of the brushland. My colleague at Leeds is a Jamaican heritage poet, and he's published a book called Thinking with Trees, and it's talking about different experience of landscape in Jamaica, and walking in the landscape, a very sort of worked over landscape in England. And I'm thinking the whole idea about the space of the unruly or unregulated space where it happens, that I think is a really interesting area. I'm talking historically, I'm not talking about the...
Yes, I mean, I was interested in the forest because, there's such interesting work, for example, by Eduardo Cohn, whose beautiful book called How Forests Think, looks at, takes a kind of Peircean semiotic approach and looks at, how we can think about communication in very, very different ways, or semiosis in very, very different ways, which take us beyond thinking about communication and about human-centered views of communication.
Can I ask something, Mike? Let me turn on my... The translanguaging literature, I've been trying to make sense of Garcia and Arthur Guy's stuff about repertoire and about the unitary system that they insist on. So when bilinguals don't have two separate languages in their head, they have one linguistic system. But your capoeira stuff it says something different. They say that what people have is a repertoire that the individual has, so they can pick from it from within their unitary system. But it seems to me that capoeira, the thing about the capoeira in Portuguese, its difference to standard Portuguese or whatever is not just about a language difference. It's a practices difference. It's identity difference. It's all kinds of things. It's not just. It doesn't sit in the individual's head as a repertoire that they can use in a non-context specific way.
And to be honest, I don't completely buy the idea that everything is sort of in the repertoire as one thing. I sort of think of similarities and differences as being the elements. I do think there are kind of differences as well as similarities. So yeah, I mean, that would be my perspective. I think there's also been a problem with translanguaging. It's very much developed within education, and it really needs to get out into the world and sort of to run around, which is actually, I think, what we were trying to do in our book. TK and I was actually looking at it not sort of pedagogical strategy, but as how do people operate. And I'm currently I'm working with somebody who's a specialist in Moroccan Arabic in North Africa. North Africa is an absolute sort of paradise of language, of all sorts of diversity. And it's just seeing how it happens in the world, I think, is the way to go. Don't have any particular sort of neurological or cognitive sort of pigeonholing of language, to be honest. I'm more interested in how it's used, I suppose.
Yes, thanks.
Actually, if I may say something, you know, I also think that repertoires is not enough. If you think about the ways in which people move, it is about, for me, it has always been the intersection, especially because of this diachronic angle that Catherine was talking about, which is the intersection between repertoires and archives. And maybe it's the intersection between repertoires and archives brings up a nexus where you can actually explain further what is happening there, which I think is what Kathy was bringing. The tracing back of this archive. I'm not sure if archive is the best word for this. It will let me know. But it is this tracing back of all these archives of everything that is there happening at the same time and constructing that semiotic repertoire, which is, you know, emerges out of there. It emerges out of there. It's, you know, that's where the issue of interaction kind of, you know, it was out of the best way of talking about this. It was this, you know, this emerging out of that, you know, was, I don't know how to say this in English or in Portuguese, but, you know, it was there. And that's what we want to explore. And I think that bringing repertoires together with the archives in the here and now might help us explore a bit further what, you know, what is happening. Not sure if it makes sense. I'm not sure if this is making sense, but
yes, that sounds good.
Yeah. Okay, so I'm not sure if you want to have a last turn, you know, a last, if anyone wants to say something, it is the moment, because we need to wrap up. We've been here talking for 2 hours already, and it's quite a long time, and so if anyone wants to say something, it's the moment now. Please do a last, you know, just a last turn. It would be great.
It's been a fascinating discussion, and the data, the capoeira data is so rich. There are so many ways one could look at it, and I think we've had an amazing sort of walk through all the possibilities, some interesting possibilities. Thank you. It's been stimulating.
Jolana, would you like to say something?
Yes, I would also like to say thank you, yeah, especially for the questions, because I think that's what really helps to move us, or especially me, to move forward. Thank you, Margaret. It's definitely something I would like to look into in more detail. So thank you for pointing that out, for singling out language in the process. I guess that's what happens. Like it always depends on the background. Like I'm always kind of a little bit biased because I'm a language teacher. So, but thanks for pointing that out. And thank you to Kathy as well. Thank Kathy again. Thank you so much.
Yeah. That's fine. I'm happy. I'm just very grateful to have had this opportunity, and also to be forced to read the paper so closely. And I did look at a couple of the other pieces of work around it, and your book, Mike, and so on. So it's been a very valuable process for me as well. Yeah.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Oh. Mike,
lovely to see you all.
Yeah.
Alan.
So yeah, we would like to say thanks to everybody. So we are going now to interrupt the transmission, and we are going to have another session at 2 o'clock in Brazilian time. And this next session will be in Portuguese, né? Então a próxima sessão vai ser em português, né? Amanhã, sessão de manhã também é em português, e a nossa última sessão vai ser bilíngue. So Yeah. So we have like a kind of mix of languages along the seminar. So we would like to thank you for participating, and we would like to say thanks also to the people who are watching us in YouTube. And it's that.
Okay.
Thank you.
So, thank you. Hope
Thank
to see
you.
you at 2:00. Espero ver-vos às 14. Ciao.
So yeah. No, yeah.
Thanks.
So we can.
Now we can talk.
Yeah, now we can talk. So we have finished the transmission. So.
Right.
Okay.
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 Oh, Kathy.